Hi, folks. Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. It's really my pleasure to welcome Professor Tanisha Fazal today for our special research seminar. Professor Fazal is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Prior to her arrival in Minnesota in 2017, Professor Fazal was on the faculty of the University of Notre Dame, and then before that at Columbia University. She received her PhD from Stanford and her undergraduate degree from Harvard. Professor Fazal is the author of two APSA prize-winning Best Book Awards, her 2018 volume, Wars of Law, Unintended Consequences in the Regulation of Armed Conflict, that's from Cornell University Press, and the 2007 book, State Death, The Politics and Geography of Conquest, Annexation, and Occupation, from Princeton University Press. Talk about a timely topic. I highly recommend Professor Fazal's article from just last spring, May, in Foreign Affairs on the topic of conquest and annexation. The title of that piece is The Return of Conquest, Why the Future of Global Order Hinges on Ukraine. Very relevant work, as is all of Professor Fazal's work. Today she'll speak on the topic of her current research, military medicine and military effectiveness. Please join me in welcoming Tanisha Fazal.
All right, everybody can hear me? Okay, I don't have the biggest voice. Well, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. Everybody has been really very welcoming today. So it's just been a very lovely day. And I also, she's not here, but I want to thank Christy for all her hard work in organizing this visit as well. So I always find it useful when I hear people talk about their research to kind of hear the origin stories of how they got to their questions in their research. And so I'm going to start there because I think it can be especially useful for students, but it's useful for me as well. Again, when I hear about other people talking about this. And it's not really typical for a political scientist to work on military medicine. In fact, I've talked to a few of you today, and I was saying how when I go to conferences that are put on by the military medical community, I'm usually the only political scientist there. I think always the only political scientist there, and they kind of don't know what to do with me. So how did I get here? A number of years ago, I was working on my second book, the Wars of Law book that Ed mentioned, on international humanitarian law. And I had this paper that was out for peer review on why it is that we no longer see peace treaties in interstate wars, the decline of peace treaties in interstate wars. And one of the reviewers, and I'm pretty sure it was a reviewer too, was really pushing me to engage with the work of people like Steven Pinker, who I'm sure we all know is a sort of public intellectual and a psychologist, up the road at Harvard, who had just written this 800-page doorstop of a book on the decline of violence. And the reviewer really wanted me to engage with Pinker's work. I was going to read it one day. It was on my shelf. And so it forced me to kind of pull it down and read it. And if you've read the book, then you know that the first part of it is very much about interpersonal violence, how we treat our pets, things like that. But when we get to the back half of the book, he starts talking about and making arguments about the decline of war. And now we're in my wheelhouse. And he was, and I was really troubled by some of the arguments that he was making because the empirical basis for Pinker's claim that war was on the decline was a decline in battle fatalities. But over the same time period, there have been dramatic improvements in medical care in conflict zones. And this is problematic not just for Pinker's claim, but also for the way that we think about how we code and count wars and armed conflict in international security studies, because most data sets that identify wars and armed conflict have a time invariant battlefield threshold, a battle death threshold. And so I was arguing that, we might be undercounting the number of wars and armed conflict, and therefore Pinker's case is, at a minimum overstated. So I published, so that led to a response to the reviewer, and then I published a rejoinder to Pinker and others who were making a similar argument. But a couple of implications of these improvements in military medicine really stuck with me and led to this new research agenda on military medicine. Not sure what's happening here. Let me start again. There we go. Led to this new research agenda on military medicine, one of which is something that's actually led to a book that I'm writing now. And what I was what maybe one thing that stuck with me was this idea that certainly for the United States case, as a percentage of those deployed, really dramatic improvements in military medicine. I mean, for the U.S., it used to be that the ratio of wounded to killed was 3 to 1. And that was true kind of for everyone everywhere. But depending on who you talk to today, for the U.S., okay, I'm not sure what's happening with the slides. But I'm just going to keep going. For the U.S., it's, the ratio is somewhere between 10 to 1 and 17 to 1. And that's a really dramatic increase in a relatively short period of time. And so I'm writing this book, which is...
Is it going to sleep?
I don't think so.
I think it did go to sleep for 1 second.
Did it?
Yeah, it's like an iPad, so I have to keep it.
Okay.
Not going to sleep.
Okay. We'll just... Here we go. All right. Well, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. We'll see. We'll all find out together. And so for this book, what I'm doing is actually tracing kind of a political history of U.S. military medicine from the Civil War through the World Wars to today, including mental health, which has been a really interesting project. But there was another implication of these findings that I actually sort of came to in doing the book research, because I've been obviously reading a lot of military medical histories and talking to people in the military medical community. And there's a kind of a common thread in both of those sources, which is this belief that there is a relationship between military medicine on one hand and military effectiveness on the other. And it's not surprising, right? The military medical historians think that their topic matters a lot, and this is a way in which it could matter. And the people in the military medical community also think that what they do matters a lot, and so they want to convince people to support their work. But really, no one's looked at this systematically. And I would argue that this is actually a topic that is pretty relevant today, right now, as well. So we see a role for military medicine in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We know that the war has not gone as well for Russia militarily as the Russians certainly expected at the outset. So they've sustained a lot of casualties. We see, if you've been following the news, you know that Putin has called up hundreds of thousands, or is trying to get hundreds and thousands of new troops into the Russian military. And they're having a lot of difficulty in doing this, right? The Russians don't want to sign up for the military. And if you are on Twitter, or if you're on social media, then you may have seen this one video of a Russian officer talking to new conscripts in the Russian military, where the Russian officer is sort of telling them how they're going to get kitted out. And he's saying, well, we don't have any medical supplies, so what you should do is you should go and you should buy some tampons and use those as medical bandages. I mean, that's how poor the Russian medicine is. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, actually have pretty good medicine. It was a little bit surprising to me when I found this out. So earlier this year in May, I attended the Special Operations Medical Association meeting, and we had a surprise briefing on the last day from the chief surgeon of the Ukrainian army. And so you see some of his slides here on the right. I don't read Ukrainian. It's okay if you don't. He said everything could be public. So I'm not violating any rules by sharing this with you. But the slides that I'm showing you are on the top. It shows the sort of echelons of care, right? From point of injury to an aid station, which is considered a role 1 station, going all the way back to a higher level medical facility. And this is basically what the U.S. military does. The Ukrainians have been trained on the Trauma Combat Casualty Care Guidelines, TCCC, which was developed by the U.S. military and has been translated into a number of different languages, including Ukrainian. Including Ukrainian, and they're also, as part of the aid that they're receiving from the West, they're receiving a lot of medical aid. They're receiving up-armored medical vehicles. Let's see. Sorry. So I think this is going to sleep. They're receiving up-armored medical vehicles. They're also receiving individual first aid kits. They are receiving sonographs like the ones that you see here. So their medicine is actually much better than the medicine that the Russians have available to them. Now, with that said, there are issues for both sides. One of them is medical evacuation. Neither side has air superiority, so they can't actually evacuate. They can't medevac in the way that the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But on the whole, I would say that we really see a role for medicine occurring in this particular war that's happening right now. So that's one reason that I think we should care about this question of the relationship between military medicine on the one hand and military effectiveness on the other. It's also a budget question for the U.S. So before the pandemic, military medicine was kind of, maybe we'll switch to. Can we switch to the other one? And I'll just, because there's one that's up here, but I'll just talk for a little bit while. Oh, is that there? Let's see. Okay, and. Is it just presenter view? From current slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, and I'll just look at my notes on here. All right, so before the pandemic, there was this move to actually essentially put military medicine on the chopping block. Now you can imagine once the pandemic started that this was kind of suspended, right, because everybody's focused on medicine. But now it's back, and there is very much a return to the possibility that there are going to be some serious cuts to military medicine. And we're not talking here just about the military health system writ large, but also about battlefield medicine. So this is an issue that's of policy import because of what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, because of what's going on with respect to US budget politics as well. So this is the question that I want to ask today, which is whether militaries with better medicine are more effective militarily. Now, I should say that I started this project kind of agnostic, thinking I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it seems to me logical and plausible that there should be a relationship, but really nobody's looked at this systematically before, so maybe there isn't a relationship. And I think that there are some reasons to be skeptical of this relationship that I'll go over a little bit later. But it is remarkable that no one's really looked at this before. There is, of course, an enormous literature out there on military effectiveness. And two of the most common measures of effectiveness, especially for quantitative analysis, are fatalities, where you should expect that there should be an effective medicine, but also outcomes of the war, who wins, who loses, whether there's a tie in the war. And folks who have looked at military medicine, military effectiveness in the past kind of cite effectiveness at three different places or three different levels of analysis, if you will. So some look at variables associated with the state or the military writ large. Others look at military units. So they might look at, for example, unit cohesion as a major cause of military effectiveness. And then others really point to individual level variables. So what's going on with particular soldiers. And we're going to sort of cut into this in a similar way, as you'll see in a moment. But before I go on, give you sort of the theory there, I want to tell you a little bit what I mean when I'm talking about military medicine. What is it I'm actually talking about? Because I think a lot of people think about the second bullet here, which I'll go over in a moment, but the other bullets are pretty important to military medicine as well. So let me start here with preventive care, which can encompass everything from childhood nutrition, because if you are better nourished as a child, then your bones will be less brittle. And you can imagine that in hand-to-hand combat, you're going to be advantaged if you are fighting without a broken arm as opposed to with a broken arm. But it also includes immunizations. It includes sanitation. It includes having potable water. Right? So a really important advance in health in general that matters a lot for military medicine has to do with having clean water that you can drink. As part of the book project, which is obviously related to this, but separate from this, I've read through the entire 6-volume official medical history of the US Civil War, which was great fun. There's one of those 6 volumes is about what's called the alvine fluxes. So does anybody know what that term means? I had to look it up. Anybody want to guess? No? it's basically, I mean, the polite term, I think, is gastrointestinal illness. So it was really quite disgusting, that volume in particular. But we have to remember that the Civil War was fought at a time when we didn't know about the germ theory of disease. And so you would get your water from some pretty unsanitary places, especially when you think about what happens in the context of a war. And then we get to battlefield medicine, which, as I said, I think is sort of the default when people think about military medicine. And this obviously matters a great deal. So, for example, knowing that you have to deal with hemorrhage, having tourniquets available, having tools to deal with airway obstruction, having good surgical facilities at your disposal. But in order to really treat people properly medically, you have to get them from one place to another within a certain time. And so evacuation is another key part of military medicine. And the military medical folks actually spend a lot of time thinking about evacuation. So much so that this is so important that in 2009, then Defense Secretary Robert Gates issued what was called the Golden Hour Directive, because if you are severely injured, the best course of action for you is to get to a higher level medical facility within that first hour of injury. Some people also refer to an even shorter window, the platinum 10 or 15 minutes. And so the directive was that everybody who was injured had to receive care within the golden hour. And that actually had operational consequences where they wouldn't deploy people beyond a perimeter where they could be evacuated within the golden hour. And so evacuation today, for U.S. forces, which is the army the military that I know best, includes not only air evacuation, but air evacuation that's staffed with highly trained medical professionals who often work together. And there's a lot of time that's spent on this. I was talking with a couple of Air Force doctors last week, and they were saying, one of the things that they were saying was that they always try and maintain the same level of care. So if they're evacuating somebody in a fixed-wing aircraft from an ICU, they want to give them an ICU level of care in that aircraft. And then finally, we have personal protective equipment. It's the two parts of our body that are most vulnerable to a fatal injury are the trunk and the head. And if you think about photos that you've seen of the Civil War in the US, of various 19th century wars and even early 20th century wars, they might be wearing helmets, especially in the 20th century, but they're probably not wearing body armor. Which is something that we have today. And so what that means is that you have many more people surviving wars. Now, they might survive with extremity injuries because your extremities are much more vulnerable, but it also explains sort of new patterns of injuries, because instead of somebody being killed by a penetrating head wound, they're concussed. And that means that we see much more in the way of traumatic brain injury, for example. All right, so that's what I mean when I talk about military medicine. Sorry, this is why I wanted to use my iPad, because the formatting's a little messed up. But I think we can deal with this. But here is sort of the theory, like 3 different logics at those 3 levels of analysis that mirror the existing literature on military effectiveness that suggest ways that we might see pathways from better military medicine on one hand to greater military effectiveness on the other. So on the top, this is a sort of higher level analysis at the level of the state or the military as the whole. If you have fewer people killed, you can bring more people to the fight, and therefore you should see greater effectiveness. Second, and I'm going to talk mostly about the top one, a little bit about the second one, a little bit more about the third one. Second, if you have better medical care, then you should have greater unit cohesion, right? Because you should have more people being able to return to their units. You don't have to replace them with new people. You don't have to train new people to enter into the unit. And there's a lot of literature that suggests that greater unit cohesion leads to greater military effectiveness. And then the third bullet is at the level of the individual. Because if you believe that if you fall ill or injured, or your buddy falls ill or injured, that you or they will receive better medical care. If you have more confidence in the medical care, then you should have higher morale. And again, there's a lot of literature that already shows a relationship between morale on the one hand and effectiveness on the other. All right, so empirically, what we're doing here, and I'm going to sort of show you results from kind of 2 different papers. It's a little bit of a mashup. empirically, what we're doing is we put together an original data set on military medicine, because this isn't a variable that people have really looked at before. And we're looking at 20th and 21st century interstate wars. And we have a series of variables I'll go through in a minute on military medicine. But we also wanted to sort of get a little bit more granular. So we look at a case of a within-war medical intervention to see whether that matters in terms of the sort of within war outcomes. And then I'm going to show you some very preliminary results from an ongoing study on the relationship between military medicine and military morale that's based on survey research. All right, so the data set. So again, this is an original data set that we're putting together. And we asked the coders to we sort of gave them a set of variables, and we asked them to code things like what's the wounded to killed ratio, what is the ratio of medical to combat personnel, whether medical personnel actually have officer rank, which really matters more than you might think, because then they can actually issue commands that will be followed. And then we also asked them to sort of render a judgment on which side they thought had the medical advantage. And the reason that we wanted to ask them to look at the medical advantage was because these other variables are in some ways objective, but they sort of miss a lot of context. So, for example, in the 1969 football war, El Salvador had more doctors than Honduras did. But the Hondurans were better at evacuation, and they had better training, and that wouldn't necessarily get captured in some of these other variables. In the 1962 Sino-Indian War, the Indians were they were not at all acclimatized to the altitude. And so this was actually a big issue. They actually had more cold casualties than battle casualties. I could go on with other examples of sort of why we included this variable of medical advantage. We were a little bit concerned that because the coders know what happened in the war, that might kind of pollute their coding of the medical advantage. But it turns out there's actually a decent amount of variation. But at the same time, so we have this original data set, which took a lot of work and a lot of time, and we really thank our coders for their hard work. But there's also a lot of missing data, and the data are not missing randomly. There are systematic biases to the data collection. We don't have a lot of times the country that wins. We have better data for the victor than we do for the losers, and we have very poor data for wars in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And so this we thought was a real problem for us. And so we wanted to use some proxies for military medicine that kind of allow us to include more of those cases. And the main proxy that we're using is physicians per capita. So how many doctors are there per capita in the country as a whole? And we think this is a pretty good proxy. It also correlates very highly with the other variables, which also correlate with each other. But we think it's a pretty good proxy for a few reasons. One is it's sort of it gets a little bit at the overall health of people in the country, but also oftentimes when countries go to war, they have to staff up their medical corps. They find themselves to be understaffed, and they end up conscripting doctors. And so if you have more doctors, then that should actually really help in terms of your military effectiveness. All right, so let me now show you some of our results. So this is for a model on fatalities, and I'm just mostly showing you the medical advantage variable here, and it's pretty robust in terms of statistical significance, and also in terms of substantive significance. There's about a 26% spread between countries that do and don't have the medical advantage. So if you imagine a war with 5,000 fatalities, and side A has the medical advantage, then side A will have about 37% of the deaths, or 1,850, whereas side B will have 63% of the deaths, more like just over 3,000 deaths. And there are similar results for war outcome as well in terms of statistical and substantive significance. But as I said, we wanted to use these proxies because it allows us to include a much wider set of cases. And what we found here was that there was, again, a pretty statistically and substantively significant correlation between physicians per capita on the one hand and outcomes associated with effectiveness on the other. So going from the 25th to the 75th percentile in physicians per capita leads to a more than 10% decrease in fatalities and about a 17% increase in the probability of victory. Now, with that said, these numbers the results are significant, which is good for us, but we of course include a lot of controls in the models, and they're significant, especially compared to other controls like democracy. And I mentioned at the beginning that there are reasons to be skeptical of this relationship between military medicine on one hand and military effectiveness on the other. So I want to kind of present some of the counter arguments next, or the main counter argument, which really has to do with the possibility of spuriousness. Right? There's a large contingent of people in the literature on military effectiveness who argue, for example, that democracies are better warfighters than non-democracies, possibly because democracies select themselves into wars that they win, that they're likely to win. But it also could be independently that democracies are in general going to have better medicine than non-democracies. And this is maybe because, leaders of democratic states, especially if the military is conscripted, know that there might be electoral consequences for them if they don't provide medically for their troops. So on the left here, you could imagine a line between medicine and effectiveness that kind of closes that triangle, but it's also, I think, reasonable to say that there's maybe this sort of master variable out there that's driving everything. It could also be that the causal chain looks like something on the right. And I should say, it's not just democracy. It could also be something like GDP. There are other variables out there that could suggest a spurious correlation. We don't have a great solution to this problem. If anybody has an instrument in their back pocket, please don't be shy and share it with us. What we have done is a couple of things. One is we've just subsetted on democracies, just to see whether among democracies having the medical advantage and these other variables, whether that ends up having an effect. And it does continue to be statistically and substantively significant. But of course, as we all know, democracies don't fight each other. So we can't actually make that comparison. So what we did next was to look at a case of kind of a within war set of medical interventions to see if we go a little bit more granular, what happens. And what we chose to do is to look at the introduction of penicillin and also whole blood, especially for US forces in World War II. So let me give you some of the background here. So penicillin is, of course, discovered accidentally by Fleming in 1928, but doesn't really get developed as a proper medicine, especially in a wartime context, until early, like the spring of 1943. By the fall of 1943, like October, this time of 1943, it becomes the standard of care. However, it is not widely distributed. There are lots of issues around cost and supply and effectiveness of penicillin, so it doesn't actually become widely distributed until 1944. So that's sort of our cutoff point for thinking about the use of penicillin. The Allies have penicillin. The Americans develop it. They give it to the British. The Germans don't have it at all. And actually, American doctors and British doctors remark on this, that Germans, when they kind of capture some American medical facilities and personnel, they have the opportunity to capture penicillin and they never take advantage of it, which is really interesting. And then the other intervention, let me actually say a little bit more about penicillin. So we think about penicillin today, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has had penicillin at one point or another, even if just to find out that you were allergic to penicillin. And we think about it today as treating an infection, or if you undergo a surgery, you would get a course of penicillin in order to prevent wound infection. But that's actually, like the wound infection part, you might initially think that that's the most important use of penicillin in terms of battlefield medicine. But when you think about what's going on in a particular military operation, or at least in this particular military operation during World War II, that was not the most important or the most consequential use of penicillin for military effectiveness. Does anybody know? Yes.
Yeah, I mean medicine. The penicillin is very poor to treat wound infection because the most bugs causes serious wound infection not sensitive to penicillin.
Well, it was better than the sulfa drugs that were being used. Well,
I don't know how much data you have. Say really penicillin contribute to decrease,
Well, so that's actually what that's what I'm suggesting, that it was not, the wound infection was actually not the most important consequence. So what, does anybody know what it was? Yeah.
Would it happen to be like infections of another type?
Yes.
Yeah.
Venereal disease?
Yes. Keep going, right?
pneumonia.
Yes. Although pneumonia was not an issue in World War II the way it was in World War I. So in this particular war, and in the campaign that I'm going to talk about, where penicillin actually had the biggest effect was in treating STDs, because before penicillin, if you had gonorrhea or syphilis, and of course STDs are just endemic to war, then you would be out of commission for weeks, sometimes even longer. But once you had penicillin available as a course of treatment, then it meant that you might be out for a few days, and some people even were able to stay on duty during their treatment course. And this was actually a little bit controversial. There was this one doctor.
It's not true. I'll tell you what. Gonorrhea is such a local disease. You can fight whatever gonorrhea. It's not systemic disease.
Well, all I can tell you is that, my reading of the official histories and the primary histories, the primary sources from medical doctors and also soldiers who fought in World War II is that if you had gonorrhea or syphilis, then having penicillin actually made a really big difference. Although, as I was saying, it was also somewhat controversial because there were at least some doctors who were, frankly kind of pissed that penicillin was being given to people who had STDs instead, sometimes to people who who they thought were more legitimately injured.
Maybe we'll let Professor Fazal speak, and then we'll do Q&A after, unless there are clarifying questions.
Thanks. All right. So penicillin matters greatly in terms of getting people back into the fight, and we also have another change around the same time, especially for U.S. forces, which is the introduction of whole blood. So hemorrhage is a major cause of battlefield fatality, and also, a major consequence of battlefield injury. So you have to replace the blood. You have to transfuse people. And the Americans went into World War II mostly using plasma for the purposes of transfusion. But plasma is not ideal for transfusion. And there was I'm happy in Q&A to go through the history of this. There's actually a really fascinating history of not only the sort of a fight to use whole blood, but even since World War II, then whole blood stopped being used after Vietnam and then came back in the Afghan and Iraqi wars. I was talking with Isabella about this earlier. And the use, there was this one colonel, this one Dr. Edward Churchill, who was really on a crusade for the US military to use whole blood. And it was remarkable to doctors on the ground how effective whole blood was in terms of the return to the sort of how quickly people recovered when they received whole blood compared to when they were just receiving plasma. And again, this is something that really starts to become more widely used by US forces at the beginning of 1944. Interestingly, the British use whole blood throughout the course of the war. So there's a difference here between what the Americans are doing and what the British are doing. And the Germans theoretically have a whole blood program, but in fact, they don't really use it. So it's sort of another interesting point of comparison between the Allies and the Axis. So we wanted to find some cases that where we could actually do control for a lot and do some comparisons looking at the sort of before and after time periods we're comparing having penicillin in whole blood and not having penicillin in whole blood. So we wanted to be able to control for the attackers and the defenders, but also for location. We wanted to make sure that the allies, of course, were on one side, the people who have penicillin in whole blood and are using it. And we also wanted to find some campaigns where there were enough battles that you can have at least some statistical power. And so what the case that fits the bill here is the Italian campaign, which is in 1943, 1944, right? And by this point, really, it's not really the Italians so much fighting the Italian campaign, it's the Germans who are mostly involved in the campaign. And just to kind of review who has what at this point, for the US, 1944 is the turning point for both penicillin and whole blood. For the British, 1944 is a turning point for penicillin, but not for whole blood. For Germany, they don't have penicillin at all and really a very limited whole blood program. Now, I want to just take a moment and say, for the methodologist or anybody who's methodologically inclined in the room, I'm not going to claim that this is a natural experiment because while it sort of has some of the features of a natural experiment, war is very dynamic. Lots of things change. There's a lot that you can't control for. So I want to be kind of just forthright about the methodological limits here. With that said, here are the results. And the dotted vertical line is 1944. And so we've got the US on top and the British on the bottom. And there's a really dramatic discontinuity, basically, when you look at this pre versus post 1944 situation. And here what we're looking at is the loss exchange ratio, which is attacker fatalities divided by defender fatalities before and after the introduction of penicillin in whole blood for the US and just penicillin for the British. And, there's a difference also, which might be attributed or attributable to the fact that for the British, there's just one medical intervention. For the Americans, there are two. In the analysis, in the regression analysis where we include other variables like the number of sorties, tanks, and artillery, this discontinuity, this time period, actually overwhelms the effects of other variables. All right, so let's go back to the sort of theoretical argument. So I've talked mostly about this top bullet. I'll say a little bit right now about the second bullet. Ideally, we would be able to have some data on comparing different units and seeing maybe what their return to duty would be depending on different medical interventions. The best data that I have found in this regard actually is methodologically problematic, and I don't think actually necessarily supports this second line of argument. And this is a study that was done during the Afghanistan War, looking at the 75th Ranger Regiment in the U.S. Army. And they were actually, this is early days in the combat casualty care guidelines that I mentioned earlier in the context of Ukraine, the TCCC guidelines. The 75th Ranger Regiment, everybody in the regiment, not just the medics, was trained on TCCC. And there was a comparison done between the 75th and other military units. And what they found was that the mortality for the 75th was dramatically lower compared to the other units. And the authors attribute this to TCCC. But the return to duty rate for the 75th was also lower, right? So they were saving more lives, but they weren't necessarily going back to their unit. So this would not contribute to unit cohesion. However, there's a potential selection issue because the 75th tends to be deployed into especially dangerous situations. And so their sustaining injuries that might just ex ante make it harder for them to be returned to duty from. So that's the best I've come up with so far. But again, if anybody else has another case that sort of points in one direction or the other, I'd be really interested to hear about it. But we have started to do some research on the relationship between medicine on one hand and morale on the other. So I'm going to present some very preliminary results on that part of the project. So morale is necessarily sort of a personal opinion or personal view. And so in order to get at this question, you have to really ask people what they think. So we have conducted surveys of US military veterans, and we have an ongoing survey of active duty military personnel in the US. These are really hard populations to get at. So I can tell you the sob story of what I did over my summer vacation, trying to get at these populations. It's also part of why the active duty survey is still ongoing, because we have people just trickling in. So the major challenge with this part has been just getting people to respond to the survey, especially the active duty personnel. Morale, is something that's hard to measure, but fortunately for us, there are actually instruments out there to measure morale. So we're using this questionnaire that was developed by the IDF, by the Israelis, but has been used in a number of contexts, including on US military forces. And then we developed our own measures of military medicine, or really confidence in military medicine. So it's for the veteran population, we're asking them about their past experience, so it's necessarily retrospective. But for the active duty population, we actually can do a survey experiment, because we can be a little bit more prospective. All right, so for the veterans, these are the questions we asked them about on the military medicine part of the survey, and there's just answered on a standard Likert scale, and then we sort of sum up the answers to sum up the scores to get an index on military medicine. And what we find is a pretty robust relationship between confidence in medicine on one hand and morale on the other. So a 3-point shift in the confidence in medicine scale leads to a shift from the 33rd to 66th percentile in morale. So that's pretty significant. And that part is done. That part of the survey is not ongoing anymore. It's complete. For the active duty military personnel, we're using a survey experiment, and the scenario that we present to everybody is a possible attack on US bases in South Korea. So everybody gets that vignette. And then we have a number of treatments. We vary, on sort of the expectations generally about the quality of medical care. There are a couple of treatments that talk about the possibility of a CBRN or a WMD attack. So one version of this says that the military medical community they have some doubts because they haven't had a lot of experience in treating people with these kinds of injuries and illnesses. And then the other version of this says that there's the military medical community is more confident. But because there are actually a lot of treatments here, we don't have enough respondents in the survey right now to report results on everything. But one question or one version of the prompt that only half of them got is what we're calling a reverse triage protocol treatment. And here, this is something that actually emerged from a war game that I sat in on a few years ago at Air University, sometimes known as Air War College in Montgomery, and it was put on by the doctors. And they were, again, imagining a scenario, more specifically where a US air base was attacked in South Korea. And it was really, one of the things that was really interesting to me was that most of the people in the room were medical personnel, right? Because they were trying to figure out how do we deal with the logistics, where do we get the medicine, and so on and so forth. But really, in a lot of ways, the key person in the room was the military commander, who didn't have, for this tabletop exercise, who did not have any kind of medical background. And he was saying things like, well, look, I need the runway up and running. I need the pilots to be able to fly the planes. I need any planes that have been damaged to be repaired. And so you, medical personnel, I need you to prioritize fixing those people and those things, and the people who can fix those things, even if somebody else is more severely injured. And this really caught some of the medical personnel by surprise, because they're not used to that kind of constraint. But in a potential conflict with China or Russia, that might have to be the protocol, the kind of protocol that they use. And so we use a version of this question, and it was like sort of half of the people in the survey got some of the other questions with this tacked onto it, and half of them did not. And so we have enough people in the survey to report results there. And what we find is that if you received that treatment, the reverse triage protocol, then your morale is, on average, the effect is about a 10% decrease in morale. So, again, I think a pretty, it's notable, not surprising necessarily, but not something, again, that anybody had ever really looked at before. And I will say I presented this result at a recent military medical conference, and the military medical people were kind of uncomfortable with this. They didn't like it. I mean, they weren't surprised by it, but they didn't like it. All right, so let me start to wrap up and just say, here's what we kind of feel like we need to do next, and we would love your feedback and thoughts on this. We would love any advice that you have on how to address confounders like democracy, like wealth, GDP. Any thoughts you have also on how to get at the unit cohesion part of this. And then, of course, we have to complete the active duty portion of the survey, which I think is just going to take a little while. But I'll just end by saying that I hope I've convinced you that there is probably a relationship between military medicine on one hand and effectiveness on the other. And I think this is it's an important question to think about, not only for the policy reasons that I outlined at the start, but also because there are real spillover effects oftentimes from medical advances that occur during war. So, when we think about making these decisions in terms of where we put our resources, this seems to me like a pretty compelling bet. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Maybe I'll help you field the questions. And you're welcome to stay back there. Whatever you're most comfortable with. Questions? Hi.
Yeah, hi, Lavin Goldstein. Nice to meet you. A fascinating topic and really understudied, as you point out. My family's in military medicine, so I take a special interest in this, and so does my family, I can tell you. But I do a lot of work on the Chinese military, and it's interesting because they seem to take military medicine very seriously. So maybe they have similar research underway. And even this morning, I was tweeting out about a kind of newly realistic kinds of medical related exercises. And for example, like fixed wing aircraft for that golden hour kind of moment, things like that. On the Russia-Ukraine thing, just one quick comment. I mean, I think we have to agree that the data is it's pretty hard. You don't want to go off social media type things, I think. But I will tell you, I also read Russian, and I just saw, I'll send you this piece in the Russian military press talking about tourniquets, really important. I mean, if you think about it, that's another sign. So I'll send you that. But I think you're really onto something. But one just sort of bit of skepticism, I guess, or as a question would be, have you considered the issue of counterinsurgency wars? Because those seem to, we see the U.S. has fought a string of counterinsurgency wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. We all know the story. We all know that our medicine was vastly more advanced than the country we were fighting, and yet somehow, let's just say, military effectiveness is not clear. So have you considered that as kind of a problematic issue as we code wars and their outcomes?
Yeah, so these are great questions, and I'm familiar with your work, so I'm glad you're here. So I want to also respond to some of your comments. So first about the quality, so to speak, of the data, especially in the war between Russia and Ukraine. You're absolutely right, and I'm glad you brought this up because casualty data are heavily politicized. There's a reason that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are issuing publicly releasing data on casualties, and so there are just all these estimates that are going around. And I think it's really interesting that I was really surprised a few months ago when NATO issued an estimate of the Russian the Russian wounded to killed ratio is 4-1, which was so dramatically different than the U.S. wounded to killed ratio, right? So, and to me, I couldn't tell at the time, is that just because they're like just falling back on the old 3-1 ratio and kind of updating from there, or like, you know, are they actually taking into account the fact that neither side has air superiority, so they can't evacuate? It was really unclear to me what was going on there, and I still feel like I don't entirely know how that sausage is being made. So I agree with you about the challenges with the data, but you know, to your point about Russia kind of discovering tourniquets, I would stand by the claim that Ukraine definitely has a medical advantage in this case. And you know, just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, I'm in touch with this one U.S. doctor who's been in Ukraine, and who's been in Ukraine for a long time, actually, even before the war. And he did a podcast, so I'm not going to reveal anything of my conversations with him, but he did a podcast where he was talking about the status of Ukrainian military medicine and how far it advanced since 2014, since the invasion of 2014. And so the Ukrainians not only went to war with tourniquets, which is, by the way, another really interesting story of kind of how tourniquets fell out of use and then came back historically. But not only did they go to war with tourniquets, but they're using fresh whole blood in a similar way that U.S. forces used fresh whole blood in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Russians, I just don't think, are even thinking about that. So I think it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians are doing better on the medical front. But your question is, I'm going to sort of rephrase your question, but please tell me if I've got it wrong. When we're thinking about improvements in military medicine in the most recent wars, especially that the U.S. has fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, how much of the numbers, the outcomes that we see are due to the medicine, and how much of it is a result of just the nature of the war?
Also, I think Vietnam is a very powerful example where I think that's where the golden hour sort of, like this idea of medevacing troops really came into being.
So actually the golden hour, this term is attributed to this one trauma surgeon from like the 90s, I think. But that concept has been around. When I read testimonies or archives, primary sources from World War II, they're talking about the gold. They're not using that phrase, but they're talking. I mean, the doctors figured this out a while back, and it's just a question of whether it was translated into actual military practice. But I think that there is no doubt that the nature of the war matters because of the air superiority issue, right? But I also think that part of what we see, what might matter even more in terms of the medical advances, is the duration of the war. The war lasts so long that the medicine has a chance to get much better. And it's really interesting to compare that, for example, to, and I know the US case the best because that's the case I'm working on for my book, but to compare that, for example, to the US in World War I, where the US is in the war for a very short period of time, and there's this enormous 18-volume official medical history of World War I, which again, I read, so you don't have to. And it is remarkable how many things they were kind of just about to do, and then the war ended. So I think actually it's the duration of the war in combination with much better data collection practices that allowed the US military to really do a lot of re-engineering on the military medical side.
Great. A bunch of people just go around. Jeff, Walter, Tyler. Go ahead, Jeff.
Terrific. Nisha, this is great talk. Thank you so much. You have such a great nose for great research topics, and I always learn so much from it. I have lots of questions, and I won't hit you with all of them, but I wondered in particular about sort of a different aspect of what Lau was talking about with the Vietnam War. The famous notion of Robert McNamara is like, we got to work on the body count, and that gets us to victory, right? And the sort of easy equation of, fatalities to victory, that seems too simplistic to me. And so I would want to know more about that. And then here's my hopefully helpful suggestion about the sort of the latent variable problem or emitted variable problem, because it does strike me as significant, and potentially sort of irresolvable at the national level. And so if I were in your shoes, I would think about coming down a level. You were saying how there's sort of 3 levels that people have investigated the problem at, and looking for, within a particular service, like the U.S. military or the U.S. Navy or some other, Israeli army, are there units within that service that have particularly either effective or ineffective battlefield medicine that can help you with that question? Because it seems to me a lot of the latent variables that you were talking about as being potential confounders, like democracy or GDP per capita or what have you, like sort of general national capability, those ones are not going to be perfectly controlled, but they're probably better resolved at that lower level. A lot of them would be, you could hold them constant and approach the problem that way. So it seems to me like if you were able to locate units that were either very effective or very ineffective, it would be at that point feasible to then try to match to units that were sort of similar on other variables, right? So you wouldn't want, as you said, like if a particular, like the 75th was known to go in and be like the most, the shock troops or whatever, then you'd want to compare them to another shock troop type of division that would give you leverage on the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The problem is finding those cases, right? And not only finding the cases, but having the data be available. So I was mentioning in response to Lyle's question that and Isabella and I were talking about this earlier, a really important change over time, at least for the US military, has been in data collection practices. So we have much better data on medicine today, and it's collected. It's not perfect by any means, but it's collected much more systematically than we did in the past. But the data that we have is really on patient outcomes, and it doesn't, it's anonymized and it doesn't match to specific units. So you kind of have to rely on these studies that people are doing. I mean, that's part of the reason that we included the penicillin and whole blood study, because there's just like a regression discontinuity effectively. And there's a specific set of, I'm not going to name all the names of the units, but it is a specific set of units, and we're looking at this before and after for those units. I agree with you, basically. I just haven't been able to implement that suggestion. Again, if anybody has it in their back pocket, let me know. And let me also mention that, you were suggesting within a particular service, but this can be especially if you're looking at a whole military, and in some ways this kind of undermines a lot of what I was just saying, just the data issue is really remarkable, because even in the US military, not all the services code wounded the same. So the Marines, for example, will, they have a much lower standard for coding somebody as wounded. Surprisingly, perhaps. And so they have a much lower mortality rate as well, right? So there's so many inconsistencies that it can get really hard to get at some of these numbers. But I also agree with you about this equation of or using fatality as a measure of military effectiveness. Here we're kind of just following the field, like we're doing what other people have done, because so much of the literature on military effectiveness does use fatalities as one of the outcome variables. I actually think it's kind of obvious that there should be an effective military medicine on fatality. So in that sense, it's kind of the easy case for us. But that's why we also use military outcomes. And I think it would be interesting to follow someone like Caitlin Talmadge, who looks at task performance as a variable, as an outcome variable. And I think that our results are kind of suggestive of that, especially the qualitative data, where you see a lot of cases where militaries that are, they're just better trained in medicine end up having better results, both medically and also militarily.
Great, we'll keep spreading across the room. Yeah, Walter.
Great talk, thank you very much. First question, I'm outside your discipline, I'm just a lowly anthropologist. Would you be kind enough to let me know when did war casualty data began? And then secondly, as an outsider, should I be thinking about something a little bit different in terms of orientation? if the war casualty data, or at least along scholarly lines, is written by a political scientist as opposed to a historian?
Okay, so the question of when the war casualty data began is like, I'm going to give you two answers to that are sort of complementary. The data, depending on the data set that you're talking about, it begins usually in terms of the coverage of the data set, either 1816, which is the correlates of war data, or 1945, which is the Uppsala data, which covers, and Uppsala has a lower battle death threshold for inclusion than the correlates of war data set. But you can also ask sort of when do people begin collecting these data, right? So I wasn't sure which question you were asking. The correlates of war data for sure began in the 60s, 70s, I think. And so historians in general are kind of allergic to data sets. And, I think in this case, I think that they have a point because the battle fatality threshold is time invariant. With that said, the perennial debate methodologically, or a perennial debate between historians on one hand and political scientists on the other. And I'm somebody who draws, I hope it's obvious, a lot from history. Like I'm leaning a lot on historians for all of this research. And so I have a lot of respect for what they do, is about generalizability, right? So historians will make an argument oftentimes based on one case. Political scientists will often make an argument based on a lot of cases. And I think more is let's do both, basically. So I would say that you should listen to both the historians and the political scientists here.
Thank you very much.
Great. Tyler.
This was such an interesting talk for so many reasons. I had three questions, all of which I think are pretty short. The first is, I noticed a little bit of a gap between the way in which you were measuring the medical advantage in the cross-national data set, which seemed to be relying more on human capital, whereas in the case, it's more about the technology of medicine itself. And so I was curious, I think a lot of that's probably lumped up in that, the subjective assessment about the medical advantage. I was just curious if you found most of that was something technical in nature or if it was human capital. The second, and this dovetails with Jeff's question, is, because you brought up Caitlin Talmadge's work, so I was immediately thinking not so much of democracy, but of other indicators of good military organizations, which seem to be potentially highly correlated with this kind of thing. So I was curious how you were thinking about that. And then the last is just, at a very high level, how are you thinking about the origins of these technologies? Why is it the case that some countries are able to develop them, whereas others are not? So.
Let me just write it down.
Sorry,
No, please bombard away. Okay. So the medical advantage variable in the cross-national data set as opposed to the World War II case that I presented, I think there's, I'm just trying to think. I was trying to just kind of pulling out examples at the start, but there are, I'd have to go back and look. I don't know off the top of my head. I haven't looked at that systematically, but I think it's kind of maybe pretty even in the cases in terms of the medical advantage, in terms of how much of it is human capital, how much of it is a technical advantage. So, for example, the Ukrainians are using whole blood, which is a technical advantage, and are trained on TCCC, which is maybe human capital, right? So it's kind of, maybe it's both. It's a good question. I'd have to go back and look at the reports that the coders have written to really see if there's something systematic, if there's a trend there, or there's a majority of cases in one category or the other. In terms of other indicators of military effectiveness, well, were there some in particular that you were thinking of?
So, the laundry list of things that Steve Bill talks about what makes some military units good and other military units bad.
So we're actually, So it's not like we're not doing, what is it, like the like fired, like defense in depth or something like that, right? We're not using something like that. We are using his data for the World War II case, right? And there we actually find that this discontinuity has a bigger effect than some of the variables that he points to. But the paper is already kind of long, so we have to think about like what we can. It's like the budget, right? Do you give the money to military medicine or do you give it to something else? So we have to sort of think about what we can include and what we can't include. But why some countries have better military medicine than others is a good question, and I do think that the politics of the country, actually, it's quite plausible to me that democracies are going to have better military medicine than non-democracies. Although I will say, actually, in the analysis, it's not as strong an effect as I thought it would be. I really think that the war, like the duration of the war, ends up mattering a lot in terms of the overall quality of military medicine if you sort of average it over the course of war. But I do, how much money you have also matters as well. There's one thing I've been thinking about in this regard is Jay Lyle's book as well. And because there definitely are some cases where you have like the Bolivian army where there are indigenous peoples in that army who were not on board with some of the medical practices that they were, like some of the things that they were supposed to, some of the treatments they were supposed to be getting, but there was really very little respect for their traditions. And so that had some, I think, negative consequences for them militarily.
Don.
Great, thanks. I really enjoyed the talk, and it was also great to chat with you over lunch about, some of the cool stuff that you're doing. My question is about whether you can speak to the literature on combat motivation here at all. So I think like the middle kind of theoretical anchor on the slide that you put up had something to do with unit cohesion. And I could tell a story certainly very easily. I think that better medicine means fewer people die, so the units stick together more, and units are very social with one another. It's all about the bonds, right, between kind of people and units. But there's also the sort of like, well, that's totally backward, and it's all about kind of politics and ideology and how devoted you are to the cause. And so I don't know, this isn't, I think, a direct point in your research, but I'm wondering if along the way you might be able to speak to kind of the debate between those two schools of thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way we can get at that, but we haven't done it yet, and maybe we might be able to do this with the veterans data, is that the combat morale questionnaire that we're using actually has some questions about unit cohesion, because the people who were doing the study were very interested in the relationship between morale and cohesion. And it's really kind of when you think about it, I think it's probably sort of a feedback effect, right? Where individual and unit morale kind of loop on each other.
I mean, arguably that's why this debate has been.
Yeah. Right. So I think that there are ways that we can probably kind of pull out some of the questions and look at this sort of triadic relationship between or among medicine, individual morale, and unit cohesion as well. So that's how we've been thinking of doing it. It's a great question, though.
Yeah. Great. Reed.
Thanks, Nisha. Really terrific talk. I've got 3 short questions as well. The first is just a clarifying question of whether search and rescue is included in military medicine. And the reason it comes to mind, right, is about reading about like downed pilots in the Pacific during World War II and how it's credited as an advantage to the United States that it has better search and rescue than the Japanese to be able to go reap the benefits of all the pilot training it had put in, the hours sunk into training the pilots. But I could see how it would be not related. The second is that my priors on we might call peacetime military medical innovation, or that in peacetime, innovation in the medical arena can continue in the civilian domain, right? The way that military innovation cannot when it's not wartime. and that therefore it's very unlike military innovation in general. But you actually have, and maybe I can push you to say just a little bit more, but like a story about how that's not true. That like we can progress and invent new technologies, but it's not really about the technologies. It's about how to manage to get them deployed on the battlefield in time, or getting the people to them. The last thing I'd love you to say more about is in relation, I think, bringing your other work further into conversation with what you presented today. What you seem to be trying to get at, right, but the democracy stuff is about casualty aversion. And there's, I think, a lot more to be said from your other work about the relationship between saving lives on the battlefield and then support from the public, whether it's a democracy or not, right, support from the people for the conflict, and that being a cause for success or failure, right? So the longer that I can sustain public support for this conflict, maybe the more likely I am to pull off a victory. But if I can't, save lives to the extent that the public is willing to support, then I'm gonna have to, bargain my way out of it.
Right. Okay. So is search and rescue included? I don't, that's a really good question. I think that I'd have to look at this. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I guess I would think of it as sort of part of air evacuation. But it's not like logistically part of necessarily, I don't think, the way the Air Force thinks about air evacuation, but maybe the Navy does, especially in the context that you're talking about. But I can't remember who I was chatting to about this earlier, but it's kind of remarkable how little attention the Navy pays to military medicine in general, especially given the possibility of a war in the Pacific. Happy to say more about that as well. I have a lot of opinions on that. Okay, so peacetime military medical innovation. This is fascinating because this is actually something that the U.S. military right now is very, very worried about. So again, apologies if I'm repeating for maybe folks over lunch. When you go to these military medical conferences, they all talk about this thing called the Walker Dip. Which is this idea that their skills are going to become rusty, essentially, because they're not going to be in war anymore. And so they're all really worried about, like, hey, what's going to happen now that we're out of Iraq and Afghanistan? We're not going to do a good job. And so their solution is to embed military physicians in, like, urban trauma centers, right, to give them trauma care experience, like constant trauma care experience. And there are a lot of issues there in terms of like what happens when you pull them out, what happens to the people in those urban areas, like normative issues. But from the perspective of military medicine, like on the one hand, this sounds right? It sounds like what you should do. But there's these really, but the fact is that a lot of doctors in the military actually don't end up coming from, like there's a deficit of doctors. So even, people who end up being trauma doctors in the military start out being dermatologists. So you just take, somebody who's a doctor and you kind of just put them in this forward situation, and what they do, of course, because this is what anybody would do, is they bring their sort of practices and habits from their civilian practice. And this was actually really important for something I alluded to earlier, which is the way in which the U.S. military stopped using whole blood after Vietnam. And it was because the civilian doctors were basically saving whole blood. Like they were trained, we're going to save whole blood because there are lots of issues with getting whole blood and banking it and storing it and screening it for disease as well as blood typing. We're really going to save it for like the cancer patients. And so then there was this shift to using like crystalloids and saline. So if you watch Grey's Anatomy, like 10 cc's of saline, right? So like that was the thing that they used instead. And they also used blood components like platelets and plasma and red blood cells, and lots of debates about what the ratio is of these different components that you're supposed to use. And it was partly because they had that civilian experience that they stopped using whole blood in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it took a long time to kind of go back to it. And in fact, even before OEF and OIF, there was this during the Battle of Mogadishu, they ended up doing a walking blood bank, and one of the key players in that battle, who's sort of since become a major figure in U.S. military medicine, has said publicly he thought he's going to go to jail for transfusing whole blood. it was that forbidden, right? It was really, he thought it was illegal. So in theory, you should have this continued peacetime evolution, but in reality, it seems that what happens on the battlefield, that the needs and the constraints on the battlefield are really different than what happens, especially in an austere environment, than what can happen in even a civilian trauma center.
Great. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Two items. For the Ukraine-Russia conflict, do you think the better outcomes on the Ukrainian side are due to that they were on the defensive originally with compressed lines of communication or supply? And then on the second point, for unit cohesion, I forget if you looked at it in your presentation. Have you looked at re-enlistment or re-upping rates as some sort of proxy for unit cohesion?
I didn't catch your name.
My name's Neil.
Neil. Okay, thank you. Okay, so for Ukraine, Russia, one thing that so I'm just going to refer back to the cross-national data set to partly answer this. So we do control in the analysis for whether it's a case where it's a country, two countries kind of fighting a border war, so they're close together, versus two countries like fighting a proxy war, farther away from each other and also from the proxy, versus a home country being invaded by a farther country, and it doesn't end up having much of a difference. I mean, I do think that in the case of Ukraine, yes, the distance to a hospital locally is shorter, right? So I think that's going to make a difference in terms of casualty numbers, but we don't actually know the Ukrainian casualty numbers. I mean, all I can say at this point is that I think that the medicine is better, but I can't tell you anything about the outcomes medically because the Ukrainians haven't released this data. But in terms of re-enlistment, I mean, I think that would be interesting, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But it's not. I don't have that data. And again, we have much better data on war casualties today, but they don't include these other variables like enlistment. But it would be interesting, sort of along the lines of what Jeff was saying earlier, do the people in the 75th Ranger Regiment that has better are they more likely to re-enlist? Maybe, but again, I think that there's this sort of selection effect for people who want to be in that regiment to begin with and the reasons they want to be in that regiment.
Les Robinson, I'm a Dean's Faculty Fellow here in the Science, Technology and Society Department, but I wrote a dissertation here in the History Department called Military Medicine, Morale and the Management of Men. Oh. So we should have a talk.
Yeah, please send me that. I'd like to read it.
And basically it tracks the development of the actual concept of morale itself. Which emerges in World War I in the founding of the morale branch. And the morale branch was actually founded by a military medical doctor. So medicine is there at the founding of morale, and morale developed as a concept of a liberal concept where you have to recognize the individual, but be mindful of how you are connecting him to the group or the collective, coming out of developments in social psychology and crowd psychology at the time. So I'm wondering whether the concept of morale and is doing double work in this notion of unit cohesion, if because morale is actually historically a measure of unit cohesion. Morale is more than just how an individual feels. It's how the individual feels so that he will contribute to the group effort. So there's that dimension of historically of morale. It's not so that when they were developing this idea, the medical role is important because they're coming at it with the notion of emotional contagion, which demoralizes the group. And the things that are at the core of this are small biopolitical concerns, such as the nature of the food, the quality of small illnesses and things like that. So I'm just wondering how morale is a sort of slippery sort of concept in your project.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we were just talking about earlier. That with Don, I think that the people who developed the morale questionnaire that we're using were mostly interested in the relationship between the sort of individual perceptions of morale and unit cohesion, because, you know, along the lines of what you're saying. And I do think that there's a feedback. It's kind of, I mean, I don't know how you get at that methodologically other than by asking people different kinds of questions about their personal morale and also about their relationship to their unit. And then you can try and correlate responses there, which is part of what we're trying to do. I mean, I think the other way that I've been thinking about, but again, I don't know how you might be able to get good qualitative data, but it'd be hard to get good quantitative data, would be to look at desertion rates and to see whether, so for example, the British Army in World War II, I think in North Africa, had actually pretty high desertion rates because of pretty poor medicine. And it would be interesting to see how much of that desertion was at the individual level versus the unit level, right? So that might be sort of a way to back into it.
The other thing I would add, and desertion is important because this is what they were measuring, because it was a war of conscription. What variability of wars that involve conscription or voluntary forces. They were very aware that conscripted soldiers have different emotional relationships to the group than when they turn up voluntarily. So I think it's important. The other aspect I'm wondering is that I don't know how again, it's a survey challenge, but the thing that doctors do on an effective level is that network connection. They are actually doing the labor of connecting people by that care service. I think there's the emotional part of the doctor's role that may be hard to survey, but is certainly the networking aspect.
Yeah, so on conscription, I agree, and that's actually a variable that we're collecting right now to try and include that in the analysis. So we're on exactly the same page. And I also agree with you about I think you can do this more qualitatively, the role of medical personnel in a unit where, I've talked to people in the military medical community, like a physician's assistant who will say that at sick call, nobody comes to him, but he goes to the gym and somebody kind of like saunters up and says, "Hey doc, I've got this thing." And just kind of having that confidence in those relationships really does seem to make a difference. So agreed. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
And your talk, thank you very much.
And will you say your name, please?
Bill Feng, F-E-N-G. And I'm not a political scientist.
That's okay.
I'm a heart surgeon, actually. Practiced for 35 years and used to cover a lot of trauma, mostly involve chest, gunshot wounds, stab wounds. And so I can talk to you a little later about why the war fatality, and from injury decreased. But my question is nothing to do with medicine. And historically, war always favor a large army because they can tolerate fatality, right? And have you taken this into and confront the variable into your calculation? Now, for instance, my uncle fought a war, Korean War, on the Chinese side. But they fought a draw with America because they can tolerate fatality. You want to talk about?
Yeah, so we of course control for the size of the military, and while it is statistically significant, it doesn't have the same it's not as highly correlated with the military outcome as the medical advantage or physicians per capita, either statistically or substantively. But I would say, just kind of backing up, I think the more important point to make is that, like a lot of things, there are lots of cases where one side has the medical advantage but doesn't necessarily win the war. So the Finns in the Winter War against Russia they do much better medically. They're especially when it comes to cold medicine and dealing with frostbite than the Russians do. But they don't win the war against the Russians. if you were to think about a counterfactual, like the 1991 Gulf War, right? Let's imagine it didn't happen, but let's imagine that the Iraqis had better medicine than the Americans. It wouldn't have made a difference, right, in that war, in terms of the outcome of the war. But it can matter kind of at the edges. So, for example, the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay was one where the Bolivians were really heavily favored to win at the start, but they had very poor military medicine, and the Paraguayans had much better medicine. And so in the end, the Paraguayans were able to fight to a stalemate. So I think that this is a variable that matters, especially at the margins, right? That's where I would expect to see the greatest effect of military medicine.
But if in the margins, there should be a small effect, like it would be hard to demonstrable.
Well, I think it matters most at the margins, but it can also matter not at the margins.
And how about the cost and the spending on the war?
So
do you come to that too?
that is it's really hard to say how much, like on an annual basis, it's harder than you would think to get that variable, like how much is being spent on a war. You can sort of, I think GDP is probably the best proxy that we have for that. And GDP is significant in the same way that democracy is. It doesn't overwhelm the effect of medicine, but it does absolutely matter, yes.
Sophistication of revenue.
Well, maybe we can talk about the sort of how, like the whatabouts later
we've actually
on.
come to the end, but Professor Fazal, Tanisha Fazal, this was just fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for all your questions. Just great.
Thanks, everybody.